There was a specific moment in your childhood, and if you were born between 1976 and 1985, you probably know exactly the one I mean, where you realized the adults in the room weren't going to be okay, and that meant you had to be. It wasn't because of a catastrophe, it was because you realized that whatever was happening, no one was ever going to talk about it. You didn't grow up in a broken home. You grew up in a home where everything looked functional from the outside and felt like controlled chaos on the inside, where your needs were present but somehow always slightly out of order, where love was real but attention was rationed, where you learned very early that the emotional weather in any room was determined by one person, and that person was never you. You weren't raised in instability. You were raised by boomers in their prime. And that is an entirely different thing. Because here's what nobody has actually said out loud yet. Your parents weren't damaged or struggling or checked out. They were confident, energetic, completely certain they were doing it right. And that specific combination, total conviction with zero emotional vocabulary, created something in you that you're still untangling today. In this video, we're going into the architecture of that. Not to assign blame, but because understanding exactly what was built inside you and why is the only way to finally stop carrying it like it was yours to begin with. The boomer generation entered parenthood at a specific cultural moment, one that rewarded emotional containment as a virtue and treated the naming of feelings as unnecessary self-indulgence. Not because they were unkind, because that's what the inheritance looked like. Their own parents, the silent generation, had survived genuine deprivation, and they passed down a worldview in which getting on with things wasn't just practical, but morally correct. Your parents absorbed that framework completely, and then, with full confidence, they passed it to you. What this produced wasn't neglect. It was something researchers have a more precise term for. It's called emotional parentification, and it doesn't mean what most people assume. You were never asked to parent your parents. You weren't managing their logistics or sitting with them through crises. Emotional parentification is quieter than that. It's what happens when a child grows up in a household with no functioning model for processing emotion and becomes, by default, the unspoken emotional regulator of that environment. You learn to absorb tension in a room before it could escalate. You learn to perform calm so the adults around you could maintain theirs. You became, without being asked and without being thanked, the family's primary emotional buffer. The harm wasn't in what they took from you. It was in what they gave you with complete certainty. A model of the world in which feelings were logistics problems, things to be managed efficiently, not felt, not named, just quietly routed around. Psychologist Gregory Jerkovich, whose research on parentification remains one of the most detailed in the field, documented a specific pattern that emerges in emotionally avoidant households. Children in these environments develop what John Bowlby originally called compulsive self-reliance, a suppression of attachment needs that arises not from strength, but from repeated experience that expressing those needs produces nothing. Or worse, produces a subtle shift in the emotional weather of the room. So subtle, most people would miss it. But you didn't miss it. You never missed it. Research on parentification consistently finds that adults raised in emotionally opaque households develop a form of hypervigilant interpersonal monitoring, an automatic, often unconscious scanning of other people's emotional states before registering their own. They weren't simply empathetic. They were systematically trained through years of ambient necessity to read the room as a survival mechanism. And in adulthood, that reflex doesn't distinguish between environments that require it and environments that are actually safe. You probably know this, not as a concept, as a Tuesday. Here's where your birth window becomes specific. Millennials with boomer parents deal with versions of these same patterns, but they grew up with access to a cultural vocabulary that arrived while they were still young enough to absorb it. Online communities, early therapy speak, the first mainstream wave of mental health conversation. By the time they needed the language, it existed. You were already an adult when that vocabulary started circulating, which means you spent your entire formative years, your teens, your early 20s, navigating these patterns without a single framework to name them. You just assumed that was who you were, self-sufficient, steady, good in a crisis, the one who handled things. You built a whole identity around those qualities because the alternative, acknowledging that something specific had been missing, required words you simply didn't have yet. You know the dinner table moment. You walked in and felt it before anyone spoke. That particular weight in the air that told you something had happened, someone was holding something, and tonight was going to require careful navigation. Nobody said a word. The food was passed. The television was on, and you spent the next hour quietly reading the room, monitoring tone and expression and small shifts in posture, adjusting your presence accordingly, all while appearing to simply eat dinner. That wasn't sensitivity. That was a trained operating system, and you built it so early you mistook it for your personality. The long-term shape of this is specific. Adults with compulsive self-reliance patterns present as extraordinarily capable. High reliability, emotional steadiness under pressure, the ability to keep functioning in situations that would undo other people. They become the person everyone calls, the one who doesn't complain, the one who's already considered the problem from 5 angles before anyone else has finished asking. What sits beneath all of that is a nervous system that can't register its own needs without immediately calculating whether those needs are proportionate enough to deserve attention. You became competent as a coping mechanism. The competence was never the problem. Here's what this actually means, and this is the part most conversations about boomer parenting don't reach. What was built inside you wasn't damage. It was architecture, a structure your nervous system assembled with genuine intelligence, calibrated precisely to the environment it was operating in. You learned to read emotional undercurrents because the undercurrents were real and no one else was acknowledging them. You learned to perform okay because okay was what held the room together. You learned to stop reaching for things that weren't coming because the reaching, after a while, cost more than the absence. None of that was wrong. It was adaptive. In the context it was built for, it was brilliant. The problem is, the context changed. You grew up. The environment that required those specific adaptations no longer exists, but the adaptations do. They're still running. In relationships where you've already mapped what the other person needs before they've spoken. In conversations where you're monitoring subtext more than content. In moments of genuine vulnerability where something in you automatically routes around the feeling before you've had a chance to register, it was there. Think about the last time someone asked if you were okay, and you answered before you checked. Not because you were fine, but some part of you ran the calculation, determined the feeling inconvenient, and replied before you'd actually looked. That reflex is what we're naming today, and naming it is where it starts to lose its grip. Understanding the architecture doesn't dismantle it overnight, but once it's visible, once you can see the mechanism clearly for what it is, you get to start deciding which parts of this still belong to you, which parts you inherited from a generation that was doing its best with an emotional vocabulary that had significant and specific gaps. Your parents weren't villains. They were products of their own unexamined inheritance, raising children with complete confidence in a framework that was limited in ways they couldn't see. That's the truth. And it's equally true that what they built in you, without intending to and without knowing, is something you're still being quietly shaped by. You're allowed to see that clearly. You can choose to put it down. If any of this felt familiar, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read them to understand which parts of these psychological patterns we should look at next. If you found this helpful, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next session. Take a breath. And as always, you matter.